Now that we've talked about N fertilizers, I'm going to talk hopefully quickly about some efficiency enhancers. These are products that are out there and that are designed essentially to make N fertilizer more efficient, and that's primarily through lowering their loss potential, their potential for loss. Okay, so these are products that are essentially added to fertilizer or modify the fertilizer in some way that increases synchrony of release and plant demand. So they're intended to reduce N losses to the environment. These losses being leaching, denitrification, volatilization. And that's a good thing, right? It's a potential win-win, greater N use and efficiency by crops and less N pollution entering the environment. So that's the overall goal. There's really two basic approaches that these products work, and one is to slow or inhibit reaction or N transformation. So examples of these would be nitrification inhibitors or urease inhibitors. A second approach would be to slow the release of N into soil solution, and this is typically done with some sort of polymer coating or sulfur type coating that will slow the release, essentially the reaction of this fertilizer with the soil solution. So, not surprisingly, these products cost, they're not for free. They cost more than regular non-treated fertilizers. They're really commonly used in the horticulture and especially crop turf industries, where premiums might be a little bit higher, but adoption in field crops has been slower. As fertilizers increase, farmers are wanting to essentially maximize the return that they get on the investment of that fertilizer, that purchase fertilizer. And so, these are reasons driving decisions for growers to use some of these products. The reality is that there's been a lot of work on this. I mean, these products are not new; they've been around for decades, and yield gains can be seen. They're certainly not consistent. Depends on the growing season. Depends on a lot of things, but one thing that we do see consistently, if essentially N management isn't, if you're not managing nitrogen very particularly well, or if you're being sloppy or lazy or whatever the reason, these are products that actually can help. They almost always help when you're doing things that we typically wouldn't recommend, like fall applying nitrogen fertilizer, or say broadcasting urea when you have high soil temps and a lot of residue, for example. So these are products that, without a rainfall, that's going to help incorporate that fertilizer into the soil. These are products in those scenarios will help much more consistently, right? So you'll actually be able to measure that or see a difference in that if you had a control where you didn't use these products. There's lots of things out there. Here's just a table to talk about. Things that we see a lot of are N-Serve, DCD, Agrotane, Super U. These are products that, Agrotane is very common for urea, and it's been used. And there's lots of kind of variations of this. And there's, lots of branding and marketing. So some of these common names aren't really common anymore. They might be, fallen out of favor, and there's something new it's getting marketed under. First class is nitrification inhibitors, and again, this is kind of the conversion of slowing or inhibiting the conversion of ammonium to nitrite, then to nitrate, and so it's really the step from ammonium to oxidation to nitrite is what a lot of these target. This is a kind of a direct toxicity for Nitrosomonas bacteria. So you can typically buy you about anywhere between 2 weeks to 2 months. Going under things like DCD or nitropyrene, these are the kind of very two prominent ones. Instinct is an N-Serve. These are trade names that you'll see this market under. So if If it's N-Serve or Instinct, then you know it's a nitrification inhibitor. Okay, again, management tools to reduce N losses. Benefits can vary by the soil conditions, soil moisture. If you're fall applying N fertilizer for a crop that's to be planted in the spring, not an ideal scenario under any circumstance, but if you're doing that, then these are products that certainly can help with that. If we apply at really high rates, won't see effects in high N rates. That means you're not going to see any difference in crop performance. If you essentially flood the system with N fertilizer and you see some loss, you're typically not going to be able to detect if that product had any measurable effect on the crop itself. So it's not to say it's not going to have any effect in terms of if it reduces the loss to those environments. So let's just keep that in mind. Can see large yield increases in years with excessive rainfall, but we may not see any benefit at all. Of course, these are inconsistent responses that we'll see. Highest benefits from nitrification inhibitors are fall applied anhydrous in poorly drained soil, so they can reduce denitrification, sandy soils, reducing leaching. For fertilizing, below optimal N rates, these are all scenarios when we might see the greatest benefit of nitrification inhibitors. We don't recommend nitrification inhibitors for side dress applications. So side dress applications being after the crop is planted and going in and trying to sync up applying that N when that crop needs it, not right when it's planted when the uptake rates are going to be low, but delaying that. So in that scenario, this is a common practice, say in corn production, but if you're side dressing, you're not going to want to be buying fertilizer that has these nitrification inhibitors, because a lot of that conversion into nitrate will be slowed, and it might be detrimental to the crop if it's not getting the N it actually needs. So Urease inhibitors, Agrotane, Nutrisphere, these are common ones. NBTB or NBPT rather. It's a long chemical name, but it's really, this is the mode of action here is to inhibit urease enzyme, and it's that urease enzyme that's converting urea into first ammonium and then ammonium into ammonia that volatilizes. Okay, so this can buy you reduce volatilization up to 2 weeks. So it's not a lot of time, but it's that 2 weeks of reduction can be a big difference in terms of an end budget perspective. Urease inhibitors are most important or most beneficial when urea is surface applied, not incorporated. So if you're in a no-till situation, or if you're in a pasture hay production, or say a specialty crop, fruit trees, etc., when you're not going to be doing a lot of incorporation, this is when these products can really help. It's important when we apply and then there's a long dry spring and there's no rainfall that incorporates. The minute water touches urea, urea is going to dissolve, and then it's going to move into the soil with that water. And so if it sits and sits and sits and we don't get a rainfall, say that might be predicted or you might be banking on, we're going to get losses with that. But if we have this urease inhibitor on here, Agrotane, etc., that those losses are going to be reduced. Okay, so, and then we already talked about ammonium and ammonia with lime, and we don't want to, when we've recently applied lime, our pH is going to increase, volatilization is driven by soil pH to some extent, and the higher the pH of a soil, the greater your potential for volatilization. This is all kind of reinforcing these concepts, and that's when we're going to get more losses in those scenarios. Okay, so when we're injecting UAN, there's no real reason to use a urease inhibitor, even though UAN has urea in it, because we're getting that incorporation. And again, the minute we get N fertilizer incorporated and mixed with the soil, our potential for volatilization losses is greatly reduced. Okay, so then into the second class, which is kind of this slow release or coated fertilizers. So polymer coated, there's a lot of different formulations that are out there, and they're constantly changing. But it can be control release or slow release fertilizer. This is the whole concept. N has to maybe diffuse out from the coating, or microbes have to degrade it, et cetera, for the nutrient content in that coating to be released into the environment. Common coated fertilizers. The most common one I see is ESN. And that is essentially urea with a little bit of kind of I think it's a sulfur coating. It turns slightly less than 46% N because of that coating process. There's other sulfur-coated ureas that are out there. If it's an elemental sulfur, it's got to be oxidized by microbes. Can acidify the soil with that sulfur piece as well. So we don't need to commit all these memories. It's just good to know that these things exist and they're out there, and there are options for management, right? So we're thinking about like how we're going to manage nitrogen in a system. With urea, we've got options in terms of slowing the release and slowing, some of this. We might still want to think about using this if we're, say, injecting or banding these types of granular fertilizer, but certainly if we're broadcasting, then we might reduce that risk of loss via volatilization. Like we talked about with nitrification inhibitors, these slow release fertilizers or polymer coated fertilizer are not usually what our first choice for side dressing. In bare soil, without incorporation, runoff can happen at any time in a heavy rain. So, if we're flying, say, if spring like we had this spring when it was very, very wet and it was difficult to get in side dress, we could think about this as an alternative management strategy, or plan B or C, where we would go and maybe fly this on, or apply late season, where we would just kind of broadcast this and not be able to actually incorporate it. So this provides options for farmers as well, right? So and then I'll just mention that environmental benefits, all of this is from a perspective of, are you going to see a return on investment from your crop, right? So does it actually make a difference? Does it do anything? Well, I'll just say that there are plenty of environmental benefits, and maybe that's as a grower sufficient enough justification to use these products, that they want to limit the amount of nitrogen that's leaving their farm and contributing to all this reactive nitrogen in the environment globally, right? So these are products that, even though they might not quote unquote pay for themselves, or we might not see that in crop yield, certainly can have benefit from an environmental perspective. And so when we're reducing transformations and conversions, then we're often slowing processes. Things like denitrification, of course, that conversion from ammonium to to nitrate and then nitrate into these various forms of various species, all the way to N2 gas. So this nitrous oxide N2O, again, a greenhouse gas source. And here just showing different sources that are either the control of urea and then different coatings that occur, and then the amount of nitrogen that's volatilized off those. So we can see, certainly losses to the environment are can be greatly reduced with various formulations of polymer coatings, and not just, of course, the nitrogen that's volatilized, but also nitrogen that's leached. And here we've got urea. The open circles are the check or the control, the untreated, and then the dark circles, closed circles, are the polymer coated. So, and then this is showing kind of the amount of nitrate or nitrogen that's leached out of the system. So it's just important, to recognize that even though these might not, what ends up happening is growers might, instead of buying an extra 10 or 20 pounds and applying that, they might apply it maybe 10 or 20, 30 pounds less, but then the extra money can go into one of these products that enhance the nitrogen use efficiency. And so the grower might not see a direct benefit of that, but oftentimes there are benefits in terms of environmental losses that occur. So anyways, it's good to know about these products that they're out there, and again, they're kind of constantly being reformulated or packaged or marketed. It's unclear to what extent, if they're really that different formulations, but you kind of have to, if you really want to know about them, just keep your eye on the industry and seeing what they're up to at any given moment, and what products that they're kind of promoting. So with that, I'll end, and we'll move on to more end management after this.